Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about chemistry, and in particular chemical bonds. And the thing about chemical bonds is that bonds can occur between atoms, and chemical bonds can occur between two different molecules. And so talk a little bit about both, but first I want to talk about bonds between atoms. And just a little bit of background on this. This conversation about chemical bonds, it's not necessarily, the assumption is not that you're hearing this for the first time, but rather this is a review of some basic principles of bonding so that it'll help us in our understanding of biological sciences. And so let's jump into that. If you pick up something new today, all the better. But the assumption is that perhaps you know this, and so it's just a little bit of a walk through the chemical park, if you will. And so, first thing I want to say is that the best cool things happen when atoms combine. And when they combine, you're like, well, why would atoms even combine in the first place? Well, they want to either share electrons, or they want to donate or accept electrons in order to achieve a stable valence shell. In other words, all the electrons in the valence shell. And so atoms with incomplete valence shells, and that would be everything but the noble gases, they're going to interact with one another, and they're either going to share or transfer these outer shell electrons or valence electrons. And so these interactions between atoms are what we call chemical bonds. And so this is what we're talking about. And it's sort of like magnetism, if you will. There's an attraction there. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is the strongest bond, which is a covalent bond. And the name itself implies a sharing of valence electrons, covalent. And so if two atoms are close enough so that they're able to interact, their unshared orbitals overlap, and they can actually use the same electron in order to fulfill their destiny of having a complete orbital. And in this case, when you look at hydrogen, it's a simple example of a covalent bond. If you had hydrogen, and let me see if I can help illustrate this. If you had hydrogen like this, Lewis dot structure, one electron, and it's in the first shell, and it's in the 1s orbital, and there's another one, they're not strong enough to take electrons from one another, so they can just simply share like this. And so the sharing of valence electrons results in a covalent bond. And so what we could say here is this is the structure. So we draw a hydrogen, a line which represents the covalent bond to the other, and this is the molecular formula. In other words, it's the molecule of hydrogen gas is made up of hydrogen, and there's two of them. And so that's what we have there. So when a covalent bond occurs between atoms of the same atom, we call it a molecule. If there's a different atom, we can call it a compound, although those are sort of, interchangeable superficially if you're having a casual conversation. So I mentioned structural formula. I'll get in a little bit more detail of this because the structure of a molecule is pretty important because it sort of determines the chemical properties of that particular molecule. And so whether or not it's a flat molecule or it's a tetrahedral or there's a little bit of a cross to it, all of these things are essential because the way in which molecules interact have to do with structure. And so I mentioned before molecular formula. Like, for example, if I had water, if I drew H2O, the molecular formula would be H2O, meaning that there's two hydrogen, one oxygen understood. Now I can play with the coefficient, put a 4 there, so that would mean that there's 4 water molecules, and there would be 8, right, hydrogens and 4 oxygens. That's the way that would work. And so what's fascinating is you can continue this, like for example, oxygen. If you were to draw oxygen, it has 6 valence electrons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and another one would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If they were to share, each one of these would only have 7 valence electrons, and if you recall this from chemistry, they want to have 8 valence electrons. It's referred to as the octet rule, or 8. And so if you share one more pair, then this one would have 8, and this one would also have 8, and so you get what you'd call a double covalent bond, and you draw it like that, double covalent bond. And so this is good old oxygen gas, is O2. So oxygen all by itself is a free radical. It's not very happy, and so it gets together with other oxygen molecules. And so when you look at valence, you can sort of look at this on the periodic table. You can say that hydrogen is always going to form one covalent bond because it has a valence of 1 electron. Oxygen's always, since it has 6 valence electrons, it's always going to form 2. Nitrogen, since it has 5, will always form 3. Remember, this is totaling up 8. And then carbon, since it has 4 valence electrons, it's going to form 4 more. And then again, sulfur, I can add another one, will always form 2. Sulfur and oxygen are very similar. Now you might ask yourself, well, what's up with hydrogen? Well, hydrogen and helium are the exception to the octet rule. They follow the duet rule, meaning that they just need 1 more electron in order to have 2, which is a fulfilled outer shell electrons, 2 of them. And so when you look at a compound such as water, I know sometimes you refer to water as a molecule, water molecule, but compound, since there's 2 different atoms, you can see here that oxygen, let's see here, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and hydrogen is 1. So we could share there, and we can share there, and so then we would have a covalent bond and a covalent bond. And the molecular formula is H2O. This is the structural formula. So these are covalent bonds. And then finally, methane gas is the shortest hydrocarbon. You could say that it has a single carbon and 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogens coming off of it, like that. Methane gas. Now, if I wanted to make ethane gas, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hydrogens. So this would be C2H6. And then propane gas, 1, 2, 3 carbons, and then hydrogens coming off of it this way. And then I can do butane and all the way up. Those are all the hydrocarbons. Methane is the most simple since it has a single carbon. So these are single covalent bonds. And let me actually take a break from this and show you like a little bit of a video on this. I think this might be pretty helpful. Like when you look at those hydrogen atoms, again, they come together. They both have the same desire for electrons, so one can't really take from the other one, and so they share. And so by sharing it, it's a covalent bond because it's sharing of valence electrons. The structural formula, it's flat. It looks like this, like that. So it's 2 hydrogens right next to each other, and the molecular formula of this molecule is H2. And that's what we have going right there. Now, if you had oxygen and oxygen, again, 6 valence electrons, they're going to want to share 2, and so they come together, and so there's a sharing. So it's a double covalent bond. It looks like this. It's also kind of a flat molecule, 2 oxygens. Now, carbon, we just saw a second ago, it'll form 4 covalent bonds with hydrogen, forming a molecule called methane gas. And the shape of it is a tetrahedral, if you recall that from chemistry. So methane gas, pretty cool. And then continuing with this, if you had oxygen and it was getting together with hydrogen, it would require 2 hydrogens in order to have 8 total, because it has 6. So there's the 2 hydrogens, and they come together and they're sharing. And so this is the famous water molecule here. In red is oxygen, and the 2 white ones are hydrogen. Okay, and water. Let me just pause that for a second. And one of the things, well, let me let it play. One of the things about water is that, and I'm going to get into this in a moment, oxygen has a pretty strong desire for electrons. It has a strong electronegativity. And as a result of the strong electronegativity, it's still a covalent bond that holds it together. Let me, if I can animate that. It's still a covalent bond right here. So let me do this. So this bond between oxygen and hydrogen is covalent, but it's considered to be polar covalent because the electrons are not shared evenly. They're more hogged by the oxygen molecule. So there's a partial negative charge over here on the oxygen, and then over here same thing as well. It's negative over on the oxygen side and slightly positive over here on the hydrogen side. So we call that a polar molecule. So this is a polar covalent bond. It's a polar covalent bond as opposed to what we saw earlier. What we saw earlier, let me just bring it back here if I can. Over here in this methane gas, these electrons are being shared perfectly. When I say perfectly, I mean like this. When they're shared, I'm not going to draw on the hydrogens, they're understood when there's a line like that. The electrons are shared perfectly. This is what's called a nonpolar covalent bond. Both are covalent bonds, but one's polar, one's nonpolar. And so let me get back to our regular notes and sort of try to emphasize the significance of this and how you would determine whether something's polar or nonpolar. So the way you would determine this is it's kind of like a tug of war for these electrons. And so if you had atoms over here, do you notice on the right side of the periodic table, right and up, these molecules that are in dark green and have a really high tower are considered to be the most electronegative of all the elements on the periodic table, meaning they have the strongest desire. So those ones, when they interact with these elements over here, it's going to form a different bond, which I'm going to get into in a moment, which is these guys are going to literally steal electrons away, and that's going to form an ionic bond. But if the electronegativities, for example, hydrogen, normally hydrogen would be over here above lithium in column 1 of the periodic table, but in this periodic table of electronegativity, it's placed over here because hydrogen has a pretty strong electronegativity, because remember, it only needs one more electron to have a complete outer shell. So when you look at the differences, like the tug of war between carbon and hydrogen, it's very little difference. It's 0.4. So that means they're going to form a nonpolar covalent bond. Obviously, hydrogen and hydrogen is nonpolar. Oxygen and oxygen is nonpolar. Carbon and carbon is nonpolar. When you're bonding with basically yourself, the electronegativity differences are not very great, so it forms an equal sharing. However, when hydrogen, notice this, hydrogen gets together with oxygen. Check out oxygen, it's 3.5 and hydrogen is 2.1. It's almost capable, do you see here is a different version. Oxygen is almost strong enough to pull the electrons away, but not quite. So if the electrons are shared equally, it's a nonpolar. But if they're shared unequally, like carbon and hydrogen are shared equally, so those are nonpolar. But when they're shared unequally, that forms a polar covalent bond. And there's a partial negative side on the more electronegative atom and a positive on the other side. And so another example of that would be, let's see, let me come over here. Another example of that, let me back that off. Let me come over here. And let me see if I can come up here. So you may already understand this. I apologize if you do, but I just want to illustrate this point. Big difference between this and this. Okay, so here we have nonpolar right here, and the reason that it's nonpolar is because these electrons are being shared very nicely. And the reason that they're being shared very nicely is the difference in electronegativity, which is the strength of an atom's desire for electrons, is very similar. So therefore the attraction is equal, nonpolar. Here on the other hand, oxygen has a very strong electronegativity, and so therefore it's sort of hogging the electrons, and so over here it's kind of negative and over here is kind of positive. So therefore this is considered to be a covalent bond, and this is also a covalent bond, but this is what you'd call a polar covalent bond, and this is a non-polar covalent bond. I hope that's clear. And so one more example of this. Let me go blue again. So obviously, it's not obvious, but obviously if you had hydrogen and hydrogen, that would be an example of course, a nonpolar bond. Likewise, if you had something like, let me put something up here that's similar in electronegativity to oxygen. How about sulfur? Sulfur also forms two bonds with hydrogen, and the molecule's also polar. So it's slightly negative there, slightly positive there. And so what's kind of cool, I'd say very cool, there's going to be a whole separate slideshow on this because it's very important. As a result of one molecule being slightly negative and slightly positive, if you had a second water molecule that's in close proximity to this, so two water molecules, these are held together by polar covalent bonds, what would happen is, like, let me see if I can illustrate this. If you had two water molecules, the oxygens would repel each other, but the hydrogen and oxygen would attract each other. So water molecules attract to one another or stick. And it's kind of a weak attraction, but they're attracted. And so that's an attraction between molecules. It's an intermolecular, between molecule interaction. So let me sort of just go like that. And so what we call that is a new chemical bond. We call that a hydrogen bond. So that's really cool. Water molecules can stick together through hydrogen bonds, and hydrogen bonds are extremely important in biology. So this water molecule sticking to this one, we call that cohesion, if you remember that term somewhere in the past. So this is a cohesion between water molecules forming the hydrogen. So hydrogen bonds form between polar molecules. Likewise, I can do this. Let me make something over here. So here's something that's nonpolar, 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 and then over here, let's go this. Let's do oxygen connected to a hydrogen. And so do you see how this right here is the polar covalent bond? That's the polar covalent bond here. So this is slightly negative, this is slightly positive, and so what can happen is a hydrogen bond can form between this water molecule and this portion of this molecule. So it's really pretty cool. So let's go back to the main, right there. And so I want to introduce you now the next type of bond, which is an ionic bond. And so if the electronegativities are very great, like again, let's go back on this. Do you see how fluorine, chlorine are very strong? If they ever got together with lithium or sodium or potassium, this would form something called an ionic bond, because these guys would take electrons, and when they take electrons, they become negative. And so when they acquire one more electron than they normally have, that means they'll have more electrons than protons. They'll become electrically charged, and so they form a negative ion. And then these that lose electrons are positive. These are called cations. So if you have positive ions and negative ions, they are attracted. Positive and negative attract one another, and then there forms a ionic bond. So you can see here, chlorine will take one of sodium's electrons and become negative, and then sodium, by nature of losing the electron, becomes positive. And so it's a cation and a negative ion, which is an anion. They come together forming table salt. I have another little animation on this, what we were just talking about. And so you can see here, sodium, do you notice how sodium has 11 protons, 11 electrons? It's neutral. So does chlorine, 17 and 17. But if you get one more electron, ooh, it's going to be negatively charged. And then this is positively charged over here in the sodium. So cation and anion attract each other. And so this is a bond called an ionic bond. Ionic bonds occur between atoms with big electronegativity differences, and they're held together by electrical interaction, so positive and negative, like magnetism. So this is not a sharing of electron like a covalent bond, but rather a transfer. And so these are important as well. Now what's interesting is ionic bonds can also break up. They can disassociate. So you can take salt and you can pour it into water, and they can break back up into ions. And so it's something called an electrolyte. We'll touch on that in the future, hopefully. It's very suspenseful. You're going to love hearing about that. And so ionic bonds are very important. So again, cations are positive. So cations are the ones that are giving up electrons. Anions are the ones that are receiving. Why are they receiving electrons? Because they're very strong electronegativity. And so salt is a great example of that. It's held together by sodium and chloride, and it's an ionic bond. It's very popular. And so what's fascinating is, let me go back here. Did you see how sodium chloride is 1-to-1, 1 sodium, 1 chlorine? That's because sodium has 1 to give and chlorine has 1 to take. But if you had something different, like say you had magnesium. Whoops, let me go over here. Say you had magnesium, and if you had a periodic table in front of you, you would know that it has a very weak electronegativity. It's in the second column, which means it has 2 valence electrons. And if it got together with chlorine, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, this has a very strong electronegativity, so it will form an ionic bond. But chlorine only needs 1 electron, so there it is, negative. So you would need a second chlorine to take that one away. And so therefore, the molecular formula for magnesium chloride is Mg2Cl. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It is MgCl2 because you need 2 chlorines, like that. So it's 1 magnesium and 2 chlorines. Okay? So one magnesium and 2 chlorine. And so this is kind of fun. You can have some I'd say a lot of fun, but you could say you had, potassium and oxygen. Now oxygen wants 2, potassium has 1 to give up, so you would need 2 potassiums and 1 oxygen. That's how you would come up with the ionic compound, and ionic compounds have different ratios of elements depending on how much they want to lose or gain. And so I find this to be very cool too. Like in some salts like ammonium chloride, the whole ammonium ion acts as a positive and chlorine acts as a negative. So the anion is chlorine and the cation is ammonium, and that can still form an ionic bond between these two. So that's kind of neat. You may recall that from chemistry. And so I foreshadowed this right here. A hydrogen bond occurs between molecules. So it's an intermolecular force. It's fairly weak, but weak is not a bad thing. And there's strength in numbers too, so it can be rather formidable. But sometimes you want, for living organisms and cells, sometimes you want really strong bonds, and sometimes you want weak ones so that you can roll with the circumstances. You may recall somewhere in your past that DNA is held together by hydrogen bonds, but it's also held together by covalent bonds as well, and also some van der Waals forces between the bases. So here's a picture showing a hydrogen bond between water and ammonia right there. And so you can see how this is slightly positive on this side and slightly negative here. So that's what forms the hydrogen bond between the two polar molecules. This is what it would look like if you had a whole bunch of water molecules. And so all these water molecules, they arrange themselves so the red and the white are sticking together, and those little dotted lines are the hydrogen bonds. Now, depending on temperature, these molecules are moving very quickly, and if they're moving very quickly, the bonds are breaking and breaking and breaking. But if it's very cold, the molecules are moving very slowly, like in ice. And so water can form all 4 of its potential hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. It's pretty neat. That will come up in a later video where we talk a little bit more about the properties of water. And then finally, another weak but yet important type of bond is sometimes even nonpolar covalent molecules, when they're really, really, really in close proximity to one another, sometimes when the electrons are moving around, there could be a situation where there's a slight negative charge on one side of one molecule and a slight positive charge. They're sort of like opposite synchronous motion, and the proximity will cause a slight temporarily attraction between nonpolar molecules called van der Waals interactions. Sometimes they're called London dispersion forces. Biology, we like van der Waals forces a little bit better. So collectively, they're pretty strong, but like individually they're weak. And so a great example of this is, here's a molecule that's nonpolar right there. All of this is nonpolar. You might recognize this as being a fatty acid. This is a carboxylic acid. This is actually polar over on that side. But this part right here is nonpolar and nonpolar. This portion of this molecule, let me illustrate this to maybe make it come alive. Like, do you see how there's an electron there, an electron there, electron there? And so this is very nonpolar. You're like, why would these two things be attracted? Every once in a while the electrons are moving around very quickly. There might be a moment where the electrons are more over on that side, and just for a second they're more over here. And so you get a positive negative, and you get just a little bit of a hot spot, a van der Waals force, but the molecules have to be very close together. And so this diagram is in reference to saturated versus unsaturated, meaning single bonds and a double bond. And when there's a double bond, double covalent bond, do you notice here there's only 2 hydrogens that can come off? And when it's saturated, there's 4 bonds, 1, 2, 3, 4. So over here there's 4 bonds, but there's 2 hydrogens coming off. Because of the double bond, it puts a little kink in the molecule. Do you notice how that angle is taking it down? So this distance is too far for van der Waals forces. So no van der Waals forces over here, but since this is so close, yes, van der Waals forces. So give me, if you're sitting there, you're like, well, give me the significance of this. If you had a saturated fatty acid right next to another saturated one, at room temperature, this might be solid because these are being held together, and it requires a little bit more heat to break these bonds to melt it. But if you had, for example, a lot of unsaturated, so in other words, the molecules were going all over the place, very unsaturated, very kinky, it would require very little temperature to melt, to break those van der Waals forces. So therefore, oils are examples of nonpolar molecules. Oils are liquid at room temperature because the molecules cannot get very close, and there's not a lot of van der Waals forces. Therefore, not a lot of heat is necessary to break them. But if they're saturated, the molecules can get close together. Therefore, a lot of van der Waals forces occur. Therefore, it's more solid at room temperature. In order to melt a fat, you'd have to apply heat, and then you could melt it to break those van der Waals forces. So I alluded to you before, like when I was mentioning methane, it has this sort of tetrahedral shape. It has 2 of the hydrogens sort of in one plane, and then one's coming right at you and one's coming back. So these are the ones that are sort of flat. This is the one in the back, and this is one coming at you. So these are 3-dimensional molecules. Here you can see they're very interesting. And so the shape of the molecule, sort of like a fork is good for poking, and a spoon is good for scooping, and a knife is good for cutting. The shape of a molecule will affect its function. Very important. And so briefly, of course, this is if you're a chemist and you're watching this, you're dying. But I'm simplifying this to just for clarity, if you don't mind. So the thing is, when atoms are bonding with one another in a covalent bond, the orbitals are hybridizing, meaning that the electrons are negatively charged, and whenever they come into contact with one another, they repel, and so they end up forming interesting shapes. Like, for example, in methane, it forms a tetrahedral shape like that. And if you had water, you can see how the bond between this hydrogen and this one is 104.5, and you're like, well, why is it pointed in a downward direction like that? Because there's 2 pairs, let me illustrate it here, there's 2 pairs of electrons that are not shown in there and here that are not being considered. And so this distance is the furthest it can be from one another. And so you have these interesting V-shape. So a V-shape in water molecule like that. Do you see that right there, as opposed to the tetrahedral? So that's kind of interesting. Here's the classic tetrahedral, and you're like, okay, give me an example of why shape would be very important. Shape's very important because the one example that I can think of is when a neuron, which is a nerve cell, is interacting with another neuron. What happens is they don't actually touch with one another. Neurons can communicate, but there's a space between them, and when they come together, it's called the synapse. So this is the space where they come together. So if this is a neuron, the space between is the synapse. How they communicate is that they release, one of the cells releases from the axon terminal, releases neurotransmitter, and it's picked up by receptor molecules in the membrane of the other cell, in the dendrite region. So these protein receptors will only pick up, they're sort of like a key into a certain lock. You have to have the right shape to accept it. And so this is a huge deal in terms of not only how neurons communicate, but how white blood cells interact with foreign cells. It's huge. So we have a chemical neurotransmitter that the brain releases called an endorphin. You might have heard of it before. But we also have discovered and synthesized molecules like, for example, morphine, which is very important in medicine because it can deaden pain. And so this it's a really important medicine if a patient is experiencing extreme chronic pain. And the reason that this chemical can act as an endorphin is that it has the same shape morphine does as an endorphin, and so it fits sort of like that key will fit into the lock as well and have the same effect. So that's kind of neat. And so finally, what I want to say about these chemical bonds is that, you know, they can be broken and they can form. In other words, I can take these two molecules of hydrogen gas and collide them with this molecule of oxygen gas. And when I say collide them, I mean literally like ram them together, and when bonds are broken, break, and new ones form, these molecules that are reacting are called the reactants. I know that this is obvious. This is the reactants, the ones that are colliding with one another. Sometimes in biology we call the reactants the substrates. So the reactants react like this, and then a chemical reaction takes place and it produces a product. This is what the product would be. So the product's totally new. So break these together and guess what happens? Water is formed. And so you're like, well, two waters. Why are two waters formed? Well, how can you do this? Like, how could you have, like, for example, if I had one hydrogen gas like this, and I got it together with one oxygen gas, and I crash those together to make water, you're like, yeah, that's good. Nah, it's not good, because do you see over here there's only one oxygen, there's two here? Now, there's a law called the law of conservation of matter. It must be balanced. And so in order to make water, you actually have to have two hydrogen gases. It makes perfectly good sense. You see how there's four hydrogens, and then there's four hydrogens here, and then oxygen gas has two oxygens, which are the two oxygens over here in the two water molecules. So there must be balance in chemical reactions. Now this is a simple one, but if you can do this one, you can do any of them. And you never mess with the subscript, because that's the molecular formula. You can only alter the coefficients of these things in order to balance substrate and product. There must be the same. So that was a simple one, but like photosynthesis is a great chemical reaction in biology. And so carbon dioxide and water makes glucose and water. And so as it turns out, when you balance this, and it has to be 6, 6, and 6 over here in order for these elements to jive with one another. Okay, so this is the law of conservation of matter. Likewise, it requires two hydrogen gases and one nitrogen gas to produce two ammonias right there, two ammonias. And so do you notice here the chemical reaction is reverse? And so reactants can form products, and products can go backward in the reverse direction and become the reactant. So this goes back and forth until it reaches something called a state of equilibrium. It sort of stabilizes. It doesn't always mean that the concentrations are equal. And so there are, and I don't want to go too far with this because it's not a chemistry class, but you could affect the rates of chemical reactions, and you could look at equilibrium. You could say if there's a lot of substrate and not a lot of product, there's different principles at play. If you recall, like the Le Chatelier principle, that it's going to favor the forward direction if there's a lot of reactant, or favor the reverse if there's a lot of product. But of course, pressure and temperature will affect this as well. So we call this chemical equilibrium, where at equilibrium the products and reactants are continuously being formed back and forth. So I hope this video on chemical bonds, just briefly, the covalent bonds, both nonpolar and polar, ionic bonds, which is a positive-negative attraction between ions, and then hydrogen bonds, or between polar molecules. Van der Waals forces are the weak forces between nonpolar molecules. All those things combine to make us, and for us to see and to smell and to think. And so it's pretty awesome. So I hope this was a good review of basic chemical bonds. Thanks for watching.